Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're uncovering one of the greatest engineering mysteries in history. For more than 1,000 years, Venice has stood on water, surviving floods, storms, and the relentless force of the sea. So how is an entire city of stone still standing on foundations made of wood? The answer is far more incredible than most people realize. Let's dive in. Before the sun comes up, Venice is already at work. Delivery boats slip through narrow canals with fresh bread, vegetables, construction materials, and everything the city needs before millions of footsteps begin filling its streets. The water looks calm, almost motionless, reflecting centuries-old buildings that seem far too heavy to stand where they do. From the surface, nothing appears unusual. Stone palaces rise several stories high. Massive churches carry marble domes. Bell towers have survived earthquakes, floods, wars, and storms. Every visitor asks the same question sooner or later.
How is any of this still standing? Looking across the Grand Canal, it's easy to believe the buildings simply float, balanced by some forgotten engineering trick. But nothing in Venice floats. Every wall, every bridge, every cathedral rests on foundations buried deep beneath the lagoon. The remarkable part is that those foundations were never supposed to last 1,000 years. By every normal rule of construction, they should have disappeared centuries ago. Wood rots, mud shifts, salt destroys stone. Water slowly wins against almost everything humans build. Yet Venice somehow ignored those rules, creating one of the most unlikely cities ever constructed. The answer isn't one secret or one brilliant invention. It's an entire system built layer by layer, where every part depends on another hidden beneath it. And that system begins in a place almost nobody ever sees. Underneath the stone streets and beneath the water lies an underground forest.
Millions upon millions of wooden piles were driven into the muddy bottom of the Venetian lagoon, long before cranes, diesel engines, or modern drilling equipment existed. Workers spent generations hammering tree trunks straight into soft sediment, using little more than gravity, ropes, and enormous wooden hammers. Oak, alder, elm, pine, and especially larch were chosen because each species behaved differently in wet conditions. Entire forests from northern Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, and surrounding regions slowly disappeared as Venice consumed timber on a scale difficult to imagine today. Every new building required thousands of piles. A small house might need hundreds. A church demanded thousands more. Large palaces required tens of thousands. The famous Basilica di Santa Maria della Salute alone reportedly rests on well over 1 million wooden piles. Looking at the enormous weight of that church today, it's difficult to believe its foundation is mostly made of wood.
Yet that's exactly what supports it. At first glance, that sounds impossible. Wood submerged in water should decay. Fungi should consume it. Insects should bore through it. Bacteria should slowly reduce it to nothing. That's exactly what happens almost everywhere else. But Venice exists inside a very unusual environment, where the normal process of decay almost completely stops. Rot doesn't happen simply because wood gets wet. Rot happens because living organisms need oxygen to break the wood apart. Once those piles were driven deep enough into the lagoon's dense mud, oxygen became extremely limited. Without oxygen, the fungi responsible for destroying timber cannot survive. Most wood-eating insects cannot reach it. Even many bacteria become inactive. Instead of slowly decomposing, the timber enters an almost suspended state. Year after year, century after century, the piles remain buried in waterlogged sediment, where biological activity is dramatically reduced.
Archaeologists who have removed ancient Venetian piles during restoration projects have often found them astonishingly intact despite being hundreds of years old. Some still preserve tool marks left by medieval workers, others remain structurally strong enough to continue supporting buildings after nearly a millennium. In many cases, the wood has become harder than expected because minerals carried through the groundwater gradually filled tiny cellular spaces inside the timber. It didn't literally turn into stone, as popular myths sometimes claim, but the process created material far more durable than ordinary wood exposed to air. That hidden forest remains invisible beneath every neighborhood, quietly holding up an entire city while millions of people walk overhead without realizing what lies beneath their feet. But the piles alone don't actually support Venice, they only solve the first problem. The lagoon floor itself is soft, unstable mud that naturally shifts over time. A single pile driven into that mud could sink under enough weight. The real genius came from understanding that no individual pile carried the building. Instead, thousands worked together. Medieval builders packed them astonishingly close together until the muddy ground became densely reinforced with timber. On top of those piles, workers laid thick wooden platforms crossing one another like giant woven mats. Above that came layers of limestone blocks imported from Istria, a region along the Adriatic coast whose stone possesses unusual resistance to saltwater erosion. Only after those hidden layers were completed did builders begin constructing brick walls, marble facades, arches, columns, and roofs. Every visible building in Venice, therefore, rests on several completely different structural systems stacked together. The wood distributes pressure, the platform spreads weight evenly, the stone protects the timber from direct exposure. The masonry above transfers forces downward across thousands of individual supports, rather than concentrating pressure in only a few places. It's an elegant solution that modern engineers still admire because every layer compensates for weaknesses in the others. Remove one part, and the balance begins changing immediately. That balance explains why restoring Venice is so difficult today. Repairing one foundation often affects surrounding buildings because many structures have slowly adapted to each other's movements over centuries. Some walls lean slightly because neighboring foundations settled at different speeds hundreds of years ago. Straightening everything would actually create new stresses inside ancient masonry that has already found equilibrium. In many restoration projects, engineers intentionally preserve small imperfections because those imperfections have become part of the city's structural stability. Venice isn't frozen in time. It's constantly moving, only so slowly that human eyes rarely notice. Individual buildings continue settling by fractions of a millimeter. Seasonal tides slightly alter groundwater pressure beneath foundations. Temperature changes expand and contract stone throughout the year. Everything shifts together in an incredibly delicate rhythm that is continued for centuries. That constant movement is exactly why modern construction techniques cannot simply replace medieval ones. A rigid concrete foundation behaves differently than flexible timber buried in mud. Sometimes, stronger materials actually create greater problems because they refuse to move alongside older structures. Engineers restoring Venice, therefore, spend enormous effort studying how original foundations distribute weight before introducing anything new. In many cases, preserving ancient wood remains the safest option because the city was never designed for modern materials.
It was designed for an environment that demanded flexibility instead of absolute rigidity. And that environment is far stranger than most people realize because the lagoon itself isn't merely water surrounding Venice. It's an active system that has been protecting the city almost as long as the buildings have stood. The lagoon surrounding Venice often looks peaceful, but it behaves more like a living machine than a quiet body of water. Twice every day, tides from the Adriatic Sea push enormous volumes of water into the lagoon before pulling them back out again. This constant movement has shaped the city since the very beginning. Without it, Venice probably would not exist today. The same water that threatens to flood streets also removes sediment, carries away waste, regulates oxygen levels, and helps prevent the lagoon from becoming a stagnant swamp. Medieval Venetians understood this relationship surprisingly well.
They didn't see the lagoon as empty space separating them from the mainland. They saw it as infrastructure. Every channel, every marsh, every sandbar became part of an environmental defense system that had to remain balanced. Unlike cities that expanded by filling wetlands and forcing rivers into straight canals, Venice often did the opposite. It adapted itself to the natural movement of water rather than trying to overpower it. That decision may be one of the biggest reasons the city survived for over 1,000 years, while many other coastal settlements disappeared. The lagoon constantly changes shape through erosion and sediment deposition. Left alone, rivers flowing toward the Adriatic would slowly dump enormous amounts of sand and mud into the shallow basin. Over time, those deposits would gradually transform open water into dry land. At first, that might sound beneficial. More land should mean more room to build, but for Venice, it would have been catastrophic.
The city depended on remaining surrounded by water. If sediment filled the lagoon, invading armies could simply march across solid ground. Navigation routes would disappear. The tidal system protecting the foundations would begin changing. Marshes would become fields, and the unique environment that preserved the wooden piles beneath the city would slowly vanish. Venetian leaders recognized this danger centuries before environmental science even existed as a formal discipline. Beginning in the Middle Ages and continuing for hundreds of years, they launched massive engineering projects, not to create new land, but to stop nature from creating it. Entire rivers were redirected away from the lagoon, using canals dug by hand. Channels were deepened repeatedly to maintain tidal circulation. Sandbanks were reinforced. Protective barriers controlled where water entered and exited the basin. These weren't isolated construction projects.
They became permanent responsibilities, passed from one generation to the next. Venice essentially spent centuries maintaining an ecosystem designed to protect itself. Few cities in history have invested so much effort into preserving the landscape around them rather than simply expanding across it. The results are still visible today, although most visitors never notice them. Looking at a map, the lagoon appears natural, almost untouched, but much of its current form reflects continuous human intervention stretching back hundreds of years. Every adjustment influenced water speed, sediment transport, and the stability of the islands supporting the city. Even small mistakes could create enormous consequences. If one channel became too shallow, tidal flow slowed. Slower water allowed more sediment to settle. More sediment changed nearby currents, affecting other channels as well. Eventually, entire navigation routes could become unusable.
Venetian engineers therefore developed an extraordinary understanding of hydraulic behavior through observation and experience long before mathematical models existed. They learned which currents could be redirected safely and which should never be disturbed. They discovered that protecting one island sometimes required changing waterways several kilometers away. In modern terms, they were managing an interconnected environmental network where every decision produced effects far beyond the original construction site. That philosophy remains essential today because the lagoon never stops evolving. Storms reshape sandbars, sea levels fluctuate, wind pushes water into different parts of the basin, fresh water from rivers mixes continuously with salt water entering from the sea, salinity changes throughout the year, temperature affects biological activity beneath the mud.
Countless variables interact every single day beneath the surface, quietly influencing the same foundations laid by medieval builders centuries ago. Yet despite this remarkable balance, Venice faces a challenge its founders never anticipated. The city is not simply being threatened by rising seas, it is also slowly sinking. This surprises many people because they assume Venice has always been sinking at the same rate since it was built. The reality is much more complicated. Some settling happened naturally as the enormous weight of buildings compressed soft sediments beneath the lagoon. That process continues today, but very slowly. For centuries, the movement remained gradual enough that builders could adapt. New floors were occasionally raised. Steps leading into buildings changed height. Small adjustments allowed life to continue.
The real acceleration came during the 20th century, when industries on the nearby mainland began extracting huge quantities of groundwater from underground aquifers. As water disappeared from deep layers beneath the region, sediments compressed more rapidly. Between the 1950s and early 1970s, Venice subsided much faster than normal. Buildings that had stood relatively stable for centuries suddenly experienced measurable changes within a single generation. Scientists eventually linked the problem to groundwater pumping, and authorities stopped most of the extraction. The sinking slowed significantly afterward, proving that human activity had intensified a process already occurring naturally. Even today, researchers carefully monitor thousands of fixed reference points across the city, using satellites, GPS instruments, laser measurements, and underwater sensors capable of detecting movements measured in millimeters. Few historic cities receive such constant structural observation. Every bridge, canal wall, and major building contributes data helping engineers understand how Venice continues responding to both natural forces and modern pressures. What those measurements reveal is both reassuring and concerning at the same time. Most of the city remains remarkably stable considering its age, but stability no longer depends only on the foundations built 1,000 years ago. It now depends on continuous scientific monitoring, maintenance, and intervention. Venice has effectively become one of the largest ongoing engineering projects in the world. There is no moment when the work is finished. Every year brings new repairs, new surveys, new reinforcement strategies, and new efforts to understand how climate, tides, tourism, and environmental change interact inside one of history's most fragile urban systems. Standing in Piazza San Marco during high tide, watching workers assemble temporary walkways above the water, it's easy to assume flooding is simply an occasional inconvenience. In reality, those rising waters represent one visible symptom of a much larger system whose balance has become increasingly difficult to maintain as the modern world changes around it. For most of its history, Venice learned to live with flooding instead of trying to eliminate it. High tides, known locally as acqua alta, have always been part of life in the lagoon. Shop owners kept wooden platforms ready behind their doors. Residents knew which streets would disappear underwater first. Ground floors were built with materials that could tolerate occasional saltwater exposure, and many families simply accepted that a few days each year the city would temporarily belong to the sea. But during the 20th century, something began to change. Floods became more frequent, lasted longer, and reached higher levels than many historical records suggested. Part of the problem came from natural tidal cycles. Part came from the city's gradual subsidence, and part came from a much larger force affecting coastlines around the world. Rising sea levels meant that every unusually high tide now started from a higher baseline. The difference might only be a few centimeters, but across an entire city sitting barely above sea level, those centimeters determine whether thousands of people can walk through the streets, or whether businesses, museums, churches, and homes suddenly find themselves underwater. The event that permanently changed how Italy viewed Venice happened on November 4th, 1966. Powerful winds from the southeast pushed seawater deep into the northern Adriatic, while heavy rainfall swelled rivers flowing toward the lagoon. The combination created one of the highest water levels ever recorded in the city's modern history.
Water rose nearly 2 meters above its normal level. Piazza San Marco disappeared beneath a vast, shallow lake. Homes flooded, historic churches filled with salt water. Libraries, archives, and priceless works of art suffered extensive damage. Electrical systems failed. Transportation stopped. For many Venetians, the flood became a dividing line between the old city they had always known and a future that suddenly looked uncertain. The disaster shocked not only Italy, but much of the world. Venice had survived invasions, plagues, fires, political collapse, and centuries of changing empires. Yet one extreme tide exposed how vulnerable the city had become to forces beyond its control. Engineers, scientists, politicians, and conservation experts all agreed that something had to be done. Agreeing on exactly what that solution should be turned out to be far more difficult. Unlike building a dam across a river, protecting Venice meant dealing with a city connected directly to the sea.
Completely sealing off the lagoon would destroy the tidal exchange that kept the ecosystem alive. Blocking water permanently would also interfere with shipping, fisheries, water quality, and the environmental conditions that had preserved the city for centuries. Every proposed solution solved one problem while creating another. Some plans suggested razing the entire city. Others proposed enormous walls. Some recommended restoring wetlands to absorb storm surges naturally. Decades passed as experts debated engineering, environmental impact, cost, and long-term effectiveness. Meanwhile, flooding continued. Eventually, Italy approved one of the most ambitious coastal engineering projects ever attempted. Instead of surrounding Venice with permanent barriers, engineers designed a system that would remain invisible most of the time. Massive, hollow gates would rest on the seabed at the 3 inlets connecting the lagoon to the Adriatic Sea.
During normal conditions, ships could pass freely, tides would continue flowing, and the lagoon would behave almost exactly as it always had. Only when exceptionally high tides threatened the city would compressed air force the gates upward, temporarily separating the lagoon from the open sea. This project became known as MOSE, an acronym based on the Italian name Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico. Construction required years of underwater excavation, enormous concrete foundations, artificial islands, navigation locks, maintenance facilities, and mechanical systems capable of operating in one of the harshest environments engineers routinely face. Saltwater attacks metal relentlessly. Marine organisms attach themselves to every submerged surface. Sediment accumulates continuously. Storms create powerful forces that cannot simply be ignored.
Designing movable barriers that might remain operational for generations required solving thousands of individual engineering problems before even considering whether the gates would actually stop flooding. Every component needed maintenance plans extending decades into the future, because failure during a major storm simply was not an option. After years of construction delays, technical challenges, political controversy, and enormous costs, the barrier system finally entered operational use. Since then, it has successfully protected Venice from several potentially devastating high water events by temporarily isolating the lagoon during extreme tides. Yet even this remarkable achievement does not represent a permanent solution. The barriers were designed for today's conditions, not necessarily those of the next century. If global sea levels continue rising significantly, the gates may need to remain closed more often.
Frequent closures could reduce the natural tidal exchange that keeps the lagoon healthy. Less water circulation might increase pollution, alter salinity, change ecosystems, and create entirely new environmental challenges. In other words, the very system built to protect Venice could eventually begin affecting the delicate balance that allowed the city to exist in the first place. Engineers therefore face an unusual reality. Success cannot be measured simply by whether the barriers stop floods. Success also depends on preserving the lagoon's natural rhythms while using the system as little as possible. Every decision involves trade-offs between immediate protection and long-term environmental stability. This balancing act reflects the same philosophy that guided Venice for centuries. Rather than conquering nature completely, the city survives by negotiating with it.
That negotiation now depends not only on concrete and steel, but also on weather forecasts, satellite observations, oceanographic models, and real-time data collected across the Adriatic Sea. Hours before an expected storm arrives, scientists begin analyzing atmospheric pressure, wind direction, wave height, river discharge, and predicted tidal behavior. Computer models estimate how water will move through each inlet and how conditions may evolve over the following hours. Based on those forecasts, authorities decide whether raising the barriers is necessary. Making that decision too early can interfere with shipping and lagoon ecology unnecessarily. Waiting too long risks exposing the city to catastrophic flooding. It is a race against constantly changing conditions, where even small forecasting errors can have enormous consequences. Ironically, Venice now relies just as much on digital technology as it once depended on wooden piles driven into the mud by medieval workers.
Both systems share the same purpose. They buy the city more time. But beneath all the sophisticated monitoring equipment, hydraulic models, and movable sea barriers lies an uncomfortable reality. None of these solutions changes the basic fact that Venice remains exactly where it has always been, resting only a little above sea level on foundations that were never expected to carry the weight of a modern city visited by millions of people every year. And while water threatens the city from the outside, another challenge has quietly been growing from within, one created not by nature, but by the extraordinary number of people determined to experience Venice for themselves. Every year, millions of people arrive in Venice expecting to see a city frozen in time. They walk across ancient bridges, ride through narrow canals, photograph weathered facades, and leave believing the city has remained almost unchanged for centuries. In reality, Venice is constantly being repaired.
Nearly every street, canal wall, bridge, and historic building requires ongoing maintenance simply to remain where it is. Unlike many historic cities, where restoration is an occasional project, maintenance in Venice has become a permanent cycle with no finish line. The moment one section is repaired, another begins showing signs of wear. Salt water slowly penetrates brick and stone. Moisture rises through foundations by capillary action, carrying dissolved salts upward into walls. As the water evaporates, salt crystals remain trapped inside tiny pores within the masonry. Those crystals expand over time, gradually breaking apart bricks and decorative stone from within. The damage often appears subtle at first: a small crack, a patch of flaking plaster, a loose stone near the base of a building. Left untreated, however, these seemingly minor changes can spread through entire sections of a structure.
Conservation teams therefore spent enormous amounts of time monitoring buildings long before obvious structural problems appear. In many cases, the goal isn't to make a building look new. The goal is simply to slow the natural aging process enough for the next generation to continue the work. This philosophy differs dramatically from modern construction. New buildings are often designed with expected service lives measured in decades before major renovation becomes necessary. Venice operates on a completely different timescale. Engineers restoring a bridge today may already be thinking about how their repairs will behave 100 years from now. Every replacement stone must match the mechanical properties of the original materials. Mortars cannot be too strong, because overly rigid repairs may crack surrounding historic masonry. Even cleaning techniques require careful evaluation.
Removing centuries of deposits too aggressively can expose fragile surfaces that were previously protected. In Venice, preservation often means doing less rather than more. Every intervention must respect the slow movements, moisture patterns, and structural behavior the city has developed over hundreds of years. The canals themselves demand just as much attention as the buildings surrounding them. Many people assume the waterways simply exist naturally, requiring little maintenance beyond controlling boat traffic. The reality is far more complicated. Sediment constantly settles onto canal bottoms, gradually reducing water depth. If left undisturbed for too long, navigation becomes difficult, water circulation slows, and foundations may experience different hydraulic conditions than originally intended. Dredging therefore remains a regular necessity throughout the lagoon. Specialized equipment removes accumulated mud, while engineers carefully monitor how excavation affects nearby structures. Dig too deeply beside an ancient foundation, and the surrounding sediments may begin shifting. Remove too little, and water movement changes in ways that encourage even faster sediment buildup. Once again, Venice survives through balance, rather than absolute control. Boat traffic creates another challenge that did not exist when the city was founded. For centuries, most transportation relied on rowing or sailing. Those vessels generated relatively small waves. Modern motorboats, water buses, service vessels, and private taxis produce continuous wakes that strike canal walls thousands of times every day. Individually, each wave seems insignificant. Collectively, they become a powerful force. Repeated impacts gradually erode stone foundations, weaken brickwork, and increase the movement of fine sediments beneath waterfront structures.
Researchers have spent years measuring wave energy throughout the canal network, leading authorities to introduce speed limits and navigation rules intended to reduce unnecessary damage. Enforcement, however, remains difficult in a city where nearly every form of transportation depends on water. Deliveries, emergency services, garbage collection, public transportation, police patrols, construction materials, and residents themselves all rely on boats. Eliminating traffic isn't possible. The challenge becomes managing it without accelerating the city's deterioration. Tourism introduces another layer of complexity. Venice has welcomed visitors for centuries, but modern tourism operates on an entirely different scale. During peak seasons, the number of visitors can vastly exceed the number of permanent residents. Thousands of people may cross the same bridges within a single hour. Popular routes experience constant foot traffic from morning until late at night.
Historic paving stones wear down. Staircases require frequent repair. Public infrastructure faces demands well imagined by medieval builders. Yet tourism also provides much of the economic support needed to preserve the city. Hotels, restaurants, museums, water transportation, guided tours, and local businesses all depend heavily on visitors. Revenue generated through tourism contributes directly and indirectly to conservation efforts. This creates another delicate balance. Too few visitors reduce financial resources available for preservation. Too many increase physical stress on the very places people come to admire. Managing that balance has become one of Venice's most difficult modern challenges. Authorities continue experimenting with reservation systems, visitor management strategies, and regulations intended to spread tourism more evenly across both time and location. At the same time, another, quieter transformation has been unfolding.
The number of permanent residents living in Venice's historic center has steadily declined over many decades. Housing costs have increased. Many younger families have moved to the mainland, where daily life is less expensive and more practical. Schools have closed as student populations decreased. Small neighborhood shops serving local communities have gradually given way to businesses catering primarily to visitors. The city increasingly functions as both a living community and an international destination, sometimes struggling to balance the needs of each. This demographic shift affects preservation in unexpected ways. Historic cities survive not only because buildings are maintained, but because people continue using them. Empty buildings often deteriorate faster than occupied ones. Homes require ventilation. Plumbing systems need regular use. Small problems are usually noticed sooner when someone lives inside every day.
A city without residents eventually becomes something closer to an open-air museum than a functioning urban environment. Venice has worked hard to avoid that outcome. encouraging restoration projects that keep historic buildings suitable for modern life while preserving their architectural character. New electrical systems, internet infrastructure, heating equipment, and flood protection measures must all be integrated into structures originally designed centuries before such technologies existed. Every installation becomes an exercise in compromise between historical authenticity and practical necessity. Remarkably, despite all these pressures, Venice continues functioning every single day. Children still walk to school across bridges built hundreds of years ago. Groceries arrive by boat instead of truck. Ambulances travel through canals. Construction crews deliver stone, timber, and steel by water because many streets are too narrow for conventional vehicles.
Waste collection follows aquatic routes. Even funerals often take place using boats rather than cars. The city has never abandoned the logistical system created by its unusual geography. Instead, it has continuously adapted that system to accommodate modern life while preserving the physical framework built by generations long gone. Perhaps that is Venice's greatest achievement. It isn't simply that the city has survived for over 1,000 years. It's that it has managed to remain alive rather than becoming nothing more than a historical monument. Every morning, beneath the crowds and beneath the water itself, countless hidden systems begin working together once again, quietly ensuring that one of the world's most improbable cities remains standing for at least one more day. If there is one lesson hidden beneath every canal, every bridge, and every weathered stone in Venice, it is that the city has never survived because it defeated nature.
It survived because generation after generation accepted that nature could never be defeated in the first place. From the moment the first settlers arrived in the shallow islands of the lagoon sometime during the 5th century, they understood they were building in a place that constantly changed. The tides never stopped moving. Mud banks appeared and disappeared. Channels shifted. Storms reshaped the coastline. Nothing about the environment offered permanence. So the people who founded Venice created a city designed to adapt instead of resist. That philosophy remained remarkably consistent for more than 1,000 years. Every major challenge forced the city to evolve without abandoning the fragile balance that made its existence possible. When larger buildings became necessary, builders developed stronger foundation systems without replacing the wooden piles that had already proven successful.
When rivers threatened to fill the lagoon with sediment, engineers redirected water instead of draining the wetlands. When flooding increased, movable barriers were designed to work with the tides rather than permanently shutting the sea out. Even today, the city's future depends less on finding one revolutionary solution than on maintaining hundreds of interconnected systems that quietly support one another every single day. Modern technology has transformed how those systems are monitored. Satellites orbiting hundreds of kilometers above Earth now measure tiny vertical movements across Venice with astonishing precision. Laser scanners create three-dimensional models of historic buildings, capable of revealing structural changes almost too small for the human eye to notice. Underwater sensors monitor currents, sediment movement, water quality, and tidal behavior throughout the lagoon.
Engineers analyze massive data sets predicting how different weather conditions might affect flood risks days in advance. Artificial intelligence increasingly assists researchers by identifying subtle patterns hidden inside decades of environmental observations. Yet despite all this sophisticated technology, the city's survival still depends on principles first understood by medieval builders. Protect the lagoon, distribute weight carefully, respect the movement of water, repair damage before it becomes catastrophic. Think in centuries instead of years. Those ideas remain just as important now as they were when workers first drove wooden piles into the soft mud, using little more than muscle and determination. Climate change, however, introduces uncertainties unlike anything Venice has previously experienced. Throughout history, environmental changes usually unfolded gradually enough for multiple generations to adapt.
Today's projections suggest sea levels may continue rising throughout this century at rates capable of fundamentally altering coastal environments worldwide. For Venice, that raises difficult questions that engineers and scientists continue studying intensely. How often can flood barriers be closed before lagoon ecosystems begin changing significantly? How should historic buildings be protected if groundwater conditions evolve beyond anything experienced in previous centuries? Can traditional restoration methods continue working if salt water reaches structures more frequently than before? There are no simple answers because every proposed solution interacts with dozens of other systems. Raising streets may affect drainage. Reinforcing foundations may influence groundwater movement. Expanding flood defenses could alter natural tidal circulation.
Venice remains one of the clearest examples of how engineering, ecology, history, and urban life cannot be separated into independent problems. They function together, and changing one part inevitably affects the others. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Venice is not that its buildings have survived for over 1,000 years, but that people have never stopped learning from them. Restoration projects routinely uncover forgotten construction techniques, ancient repairs, and ingenious solutions hidden beneath later renovations. Archaeologists examining old foundations often discover evidence showing that medieval builders themselves continuously modified earlier designs after observing how structures behaved over decades. Even the original creators of Venice treated the city as an ongoing experiment rather than a finished masterpiece. That mindset continues today.
Every restoration teaches engineers something new about moisture movement, material durability, foundation behavior, or structural flexibility. Every flood provides additional information about water dynamics inside the lagoon. Every successful preservation project contributes knowledge that may help protect historic coastal cities elsewhere in the world facing similar environmental pressures. Venice has effectively become a living laboratory where historians, architects, geologists, conservation specialists, oceanographers, and structural engineers all study the same urban landscape from different perspectives. Their work extends far beyond preserving famous landmarks. Many of the techniques developed in Venice now influence restoration projects involving waterfront heritage sites across Europe and beyond.
Lessons learned from monitoring timber foundations, controlling salt damage, managing tidal infrastructure, and balancing environmental conservation with urban development have proven valuable in places facing comparable challenges. In that sense, Venice is not only protecting its own future, it continues shaping how humanity approaches the preservation of vulnerable cities worldwide. Walking through Venice today, it is easy to focus on the visible beauty surrounding every canal. Marble facades catch the afternoon sunlight. Gondolas glide beneath centuries-old bridges. Church bells echo across narrow waterways, exactly as they have for generations. Yet the true miracle remains almost completely invisible. Hidden beneath the streets lies the vast forest of wooden piles that still carries unimaginable weight after a millennium underwater. Hidden beyond the city's edges, the lagoon quietly regulates tides, sediment, and ecological conditions that keep those foundations stable.
Hidden inside maintenance workshops, laboratories, and engineering offices, countless specialists spend every day ensuring small problems never become irreversible disasters. The city survives because thousands of individual actions, many too ordinary to attract attention, continue supporting one another exactly as they have for centuries. Venice often appears timeless, but nothing about it is effortless. Its survival has never been automatic. Every generation inherited an extraordinarily fragile place and accepted responsibility for passing it on. That uninterrupted chain of maintenance, observation, adaptation, and respect may be the strongest foundation Venice has ever possessed. The wooden piles beneath the city remain essential, but wood alone could never have carried Venice through 1,000 years of floods, wars, political upheaval, environmental change, and modern tourism.
What truly kept the city standing was a civilization willing to think beyond its own lifetime, making decisions whose greatest benefits would only be seen hundreds of years later. Today, as millions of visitors look across the calm waters of the lagoon and wonder how an entire city can still stand where logic suggests it never should have existed at all, the answer is far more extraordinary than any myth. Venice is not floating. It is not defying the laws of nature. It is following them with extraordinary precision, relying on one of the most sophisticated partnerships between human ingenuity and the natural world ever created. After more than 1,000 years, that partnership is still holding the city above the water, one tide at a time.